Hello and welcome back to Mind Over Chatter, the Cambridge University podcast. I'm Nick.
I'm James.
And I'm Naomi.
And together we're inviting you to join us in our conversations with clever, curious people here in Cambridge.
In this second series, we're talking about futures.
And in this fourth episode, we're asking the question, what would a more just future look like?
In this episode, you'll hear about justice, equality and My Little Ponies, ethnographic and participatory research and the Eye of Sauron, an existential risk, artificial intelligence, and an extended Titanic metaphor for which we are, for once, not to blame.
So, who were we talking to in this episode?
We talked to an anthropologist and science, technology and society scholar.
Hi, I'm Alexa. I'm an anthropologist and I am a research associate at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence and at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk.
A legal scholar and research associate in existential risk.
Hi, I'm Natalie, and I'm also a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk.
And a professor at the Faculty of Divinity.
Hi, I'm Esra. I'm the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Abrahamic Faiths and Shared Values, and also the Director of Cambridge Interfaith Program.
As usual, we began by asking our guests to tell us about their research.
I'm an anthropologist and I study the societal impacts of technologies, mostly AI technologies.
I'm an international lawyer, and I'm specifically interested in how global justice relates to existential risk.
I work on relationships among Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Middle East and in Europe.
Basically, in this episode, we want to sort of explore what a more just and fair future might look like. What do we mean by fair when it comes to societies?
It's a great question and a very big question, and a lot of people have written about this quite a lot over the course of history. So I'm not really sure if I can entirely do this justice here. But I will say, when we're thinking about what's fair, quite often we have in our minds an idea of, distributional fairness, like who has how much of the outputs of our economies, how is our wealth distributed, how is our land distributed, how is our money distributed. And that's one really good way of looking at it. And you can also have a think about, equality in terms of contributions, like whose contributions are recognized as valuable in society, who is given the dignity as a worker in society. And I feel like I've now been monologuing, so I'll let someone else talk now.
No, not at all. So Alexa, what do you think? Do you agree about this sort of contributions?
I do. I think about fairness a lot in my work on AI, because there can be a sort of algorithmic idea of fairness, which can be fairly narrow and somewhat not easy to address, but let's say that it could be addressed to some extent along technological lines. But I think that we can never think about fairness just in that kind of algorithmic flat way. We also have to always think about how it's intersecting with the whole world and the way that opportunity and risk and dignity is really spread out unevenly across our societies.
When I hear this question, I am thinking one of the most important challenges in front of us is balancing fairness, or more so equality, with diversity. How can we have societies where differences are also accepted, and that people are not only given resources because they are seen as deserving, because we know that so many resources have been taken away from people by the idea that they do not deserve because of their skin color, because of their religion, because of an idea they hold on to. So how are we going to maintain that?
I love that focus on plurality, Esra.
I know it is a difficult one too, because we sometimes feel like we know what everyone needs and everyone wants, but we also know that not everyone wants the same things, But also at the same time, we should not make assumptions that they do not want X, Y, or Z. So that I find as one of the biggest challenges.
And I think, just as you say, Esra, it's about whose voices are we hearing in that process? Who is at the table when we're having discussions about what the future looks like? Because you're exactly right, we can't assume that people want a certain thing or don't want a certain thing, actually.
I love this idea of the table, because that's something we talk about a lot, like, who has a seat at the table, who has a voice at the table. But I also maybe like to think that we could move away from a deficit model of this, and we could start thinking about also equity and fairness and justice in a different way, to think about, like, actually how exciting will it be, like, when we have a dinner party at this table and we actually get to hear these incredible ideas that maybe people haven't had the space to express. So I think about, what losses we may have had in history when we didn't get to, like, see the art produced by women, or we didn't get to hear the music produced by women of color, or that we didn't get to see the science that entire populations of the earth, had in them to contribute.
Can I just ask each of you at this point, because we've heard fairness, we've heard justice, and we've heard equality, and we've heard other things as well. Are those all synonymous for you guys? Do they all basically mean the same thing?
I think among them, I like the justice the most. I think that is what I want in the world, because justice does not assume equality or sameness. There can be difference, but we can still make claims for justice without wanting to be the same. And justice is also not peace. Sometimes people assume that when there is peace, meaning when there is no fighting, it must be fine. But it is not. We have lots of cases of people have been quieted down, or they do not have the means to speak.
I would second that. I feel like those terms are not all the same, but the most powerful among them is justice.
Yeah, I think justice definitely speaks to a wider range of people and almost everyone. When we're talking about equality, often what we're talking about is equality of opportunity, right? This idea that, like, everyone should be given the equal chance in life, and kind of in terms of education, access to experiences, all this kind of thing. But I think we have to realize that this is only really the starting point. And even a society in which there was perfect equality of opportunity, it might still have these great inequalities in terms of wealth, in terms of power. And it might be quite unjust in some ways. So I also tend to agree that, like, justice is such a powerful concept.
Esra, you mentioned at some point in an earlier answer, you mentioned empathy and plurality. Now, empathy is almost universally seen as a good thing, capital G, capital T, almost certainly necessary to help create a more fair and just society. But I believe I'm correct in saying that some of your research points to a possible downside of empathy. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, let's say not suspicion, but let's say my nuanced approach to empathy came out of my research. I have been working on Holocaust memory education programs designed for Muslims in Germany, where there is a lot of emphasis that Muslims do not, have empathy towards the Jewish victims. That they are so anti-Semitic that they cannot have this empathy. So I have been thinking a lot about that, and also I have been thinking about how the youth that I have been working with, they had intense feelings of empathy. So how am I going to reconcile that? And the more I talk to the Holocaust educators and also the youth, I have realized that in that context, but I think it exists in other contexts too, there is one understanding of empathy. For example, in this very specific context, it is more from the white German perspective that they are expected to take a position of the repentant perpetrator, and that they are asked to imagine themselves in this powerful position and then put themselves on the place of victimized Jews, feel badly, sorry, and then come back having transformed. But I have realized that the Muslims in this context were imagining themselves as they could also be victimized. So they were very closely affiliating with them, with the Jewish victims, and then they would say, oh no, if this happened again, then we would be victims. So they were expressing fear. And this was driving the Holocaust educators crazy, because in the German political landscape, not the increasing far right now, but the kind of national identity they have established for themselves successfully since the Second World War, that you should never imagine yourself as the victim, that you should take the perpetrator position on your shoulders and try to deal with that. So then I have also realized lots of political emotions are like that: compassion, empathy, or many others. If we base our choices on these emotions, that is also difficult to go to more just places. There are also lots of expectations that go into those emotions.
Esra, that's so interesting. Is that kind of like pointing to, in a way, like a lack of empathy on the part of the German Holocaust educators in terms of like not being able to even imagine what it must be like to be a Muslim in that society?
Yes, exactly. And also empathy is like put into this box. It should take only this form, and this is the way you should feel it, and out of this politically correct place will be reached. It would be also the same for compassion. It assumes that you have everything, and for a moment you think about people who do not have, and then you come back and then you decide to give. But then who gets to have the compassion and who maybe cannot have it?
And Alexa, can I ask, in the context of your work, so you clearly are thinking about fairness and justice, but does empathy and compassion come into that equation for you?
Yeah, I love this conversation so much, and it makes me think about the distinction between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy that some social science researchers have made. So thinking about empathy maybe less in terms of an emotional response, but more as a way to sort of systemically begin to understand something from someone else's perspective.
Okay, hang on, time out. You guys started talking about fairness, but this led quickly to talk of justice and equality. What's that about?
Yeah, justice, fairness, and equality are vastly different things, it turns out, and achieving one doesn't mean you have the others. A bit like Martin Luther King's no peace without justice, except with peace and justice instead of, say, fairness and justice.
Everyone was in agreement, however, that justice is key.
We can break down the idea of fairness to the different ways in which certain resources are distributed, like wealth, power, and land.
Although fairness is also about individuals and groups getting a fair acknowledgement of their contribution to otherwise collective resources.
Basically, the key point is that a fair distribution of resources isn't necessarily an equal distribution of resources. So fairness doesn't always equal equality.
Yes, and we don't necessarily know the fairest way to divide resources.
Am I right that Alexa mentioned something called the deficit model? What's that?
Good spot! The deficit model is a way of thinking about social inequality by framing things in terms of what someone is lacking. This perpetuates the idea that certain groups have failed to acquire a particular resource for themselves, and are therefore dependent on others to provide it for them.
Exactly, and as the name suggests, this model implies a deficiency of a particular group, when maybe they don't really care about that thing anyway. I, for example, am deficient in My Little Pony dolls, but it doesn't really bother me. I think.
As Esra said, different communities have different needs, although I suspect nobody really needs a My Little Pony.
So, is this why all of our guests agreed that justice is maybe the most useful thing to talk about? Because it doesn't assume the sameness of simple equality?
Exactly. Justice means catering to the specific needs of different groups, which is not the same as just distributing resources equally.
A good way to think about all of this is through how we go about catering to medical needs. Distributing medicine equally between all people brings about equality.
Lemsip for all!
Exactly. But providing medicine only to those people who are sick is fair,
If less catchy.
and ensuring that all of those who are sick have an equal opportunity to get the medicine is just.
And identifying who should get the medicine isn't just about deficits. As in, it's not just about who doesn't already have the medicine, as clearly some healthy people won't have it and won't need it. So in trying to work out who should get the medicine, we also need to find people that want and need it. One way to do this is to use empathy as a way to try and learn about other people.
But did I hear Esra correctly? There might be some possible downsides to empathy?
Yes, you did. I knew there was something funny going on there.
Well, firstly, empathy means different things to different people. Often we think of empathy as putting ourselves in the shoes of those who are less fortunate, as a way of inspiring ourselves to offer some help.
But justice means treating everyone as equals, not imagining yourself as being superior in some way. And sometimes, not always, using the language of empathy and compassion could reinforce an image of society being divided into the haves and have-nots. At which point, it might not actually be as much of a good thing as we always assume.
This also brings us to Alexa's point about different ways of thinking about empathy. She suggested that rather than thinking about empathy as an emotional act, as something we do to make us feel more compassionate, we should think about empathy as a cognitive act. This means we should consciously try to understand the needs and wants of other people in order to better appreciate what sort of distribution of resources can best achieve everyone's goals.
And this is why ethnographic work, which is where a researcher immerses themselves in the group they're studying, rather than peering in from the outside like some sort of ethically approved Eye of Sauron. This is why ethnographic work is so important to learn about the different priorities of different communities.
Just thinking about going back to sort of empathy and risks again. Now, we've just mentioned AI, but Natalie, I'm sort of thinking about your research sort of touches on inequality and potentially, how that contributes to existential risk.
At the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, there's a group that's just started up recently, which works on global justice and global catastrophic risk. And so what I guess we're really interested in is, how these questions of justice and equality intersect with existential risks. And by existential risks, I really mean kind of anything that could pose a threat to the kind of extinction of humanity, which sounds kind of drastic, but it includes stuff like climate change, which we all know about, but also some risks which might not be so high profile right at the moment, like the nuclear threat, or artificial intelligence, according to some people as well. Actually, there are lots of groups of people who, over time, especially in the last, 500 years, have kind of faced their own existential threats in terms of either, conquest and colonization, or possibly more recently, their country going underwater because of climate change or something like that. And so there are all these groups of people who have actually been facing existential threats for kind of a long time. And this is this is a fact that the field has largely ignored. Like, it really hasn't engaged with this at all. And this is part of the question of justice in a way, because it's like, who is contributing to these conversations, whose forms of knowledge are recognized as valid, whose voices are being heard. So yeah, I'll stop rambling about that one now.
That's all right. That was good, and that leads perfectly. So if we're thinking like Alexa, I'm just thinking about how we sort of link going back to sort of how we link global injustice and voices to existential risk, because Natalie just pointed out that voices and narratives come up.
Yeah, well, I think that we could do much more of is thinking about participatory futures. So this would be a sort of systematic way of bringing people together to imagine the kinds of futures that we want, so that maybe we move a bit from a very reactive understanding of risk, where we're always responding to the threat of climate change, to the threat of AI, to nuclear threats, et cetera, and we begin to actually imagine the futures that we want.
When we're talking about the relationship between sort of global injustice and existential risk, are we also talking about the idea that global injustice might cause or lead to an existential risk, rather than just the way in which that risk is distributed amongst different communities?
Yeah, I think absolutely that's a strong possibility. This is kind of a topic that we're working on kind of at the moment, like this is ongoing work. But I think it's really plausible that the more unequal the society, the more potential kind of strife and conflicts there can be, and the more kind of unstable it is, because you have the few people at the top who are maybe, comfortable and maybe hubristic and maybe, like have a lot of power. You have a lot of people on the bottom who are maybe, resentful or disenfranchised. And you can just imagine the ways in which this might like exacerbate these risks that we face in terms of technology, in terms of climate change very clearly. It seems that like inequality is this, it just like makes everything worse. It might not be a threat in and of itself, but it's definitely a threat multiplier when we're thinking about existential threats.
I absolutely agree with what Natalie just said. I think there's so much scholarship across discipline that highlights these troubling links between social inequality and political and economic instability, authoritarian forms of government, civil unrest, violent conflict, forced migration. So yeah, I think it's a real driver of risk.
And actually this comes back to what Esra said. It's as if we're all in a big boat. Let's say we're all on a cruise liner, we're on the Titanic, and there's this, like lots of people up, like are underneath the decks, and there's a hole in the bottom of the boat, and it's, like, and the people on the top deck have only really just started noticing at the point when the deck, slips and slides and tilts, except as the people on the bottom who have noticed that the hole has been there for a long time. And it's this inequality of the maldistribution of, like of the weight of all the people in the ship that's caused this in the first place. Yeah, there might not be an exact analogy, because I recall that in the case of the Titanic, there was an iceberg, not just not just too many people on the boat. But
yeah, this I think this is a great analogy, and also it reminds me very much of the discussions about the COVID vaccine, right? To make the point that the UK or the US, the affluent countries who are able to buy a lot of the vaccine and now are vaccinating their populations, are asked to share some of it with other countries who don't have the means. And the argument that is being made is not that it is just, that is, those people are also dying too, just like you and your grandfather and grandmother. But if we don't vaccinate them, the virus will mutate and it will come back to you, right? So it is always coming back the idea that it will affect you too. That is why you should share some of it, not because it's an issue of justice or that we all belong to the same humanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, hang on, pause again. What's existential risk?
Sounds pretty scary, no? An existential risk is one that could threaten to make humans extinct, like climate change and nuclear war, the sort of thing to keep you up at night.
You know what keeps me up at night? Videos on Facebook about things made from wood and epoxy in various combinations. That and reading Wikipedia articles about the Titanic.
Well, the thing is, different groups of people are at different levels of risk, and their ability to respond to that risk is also different. This makes justice, inequality, and fairness important when thinking about existential risks.
The field of existential risk is experiencing a change from thinking about how particular technologies might create existential risk towards thinking about how society is put together such that some risks might be particularly heightened and others diminished.
Also, what even counts as an existential risk is heavily dependent on who you ask. For example, some risks, such as climate change, pose a much greater threat to people living on coastlines, in the global south, and in areas more prone to extreme weather.
And if you were to ask me...
Well, we're not asking you.
If you were to ask me, then I'd say sentient Tamagotchis are pretty much the definition of an existential risk.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in here. So, how can we make the study of existential risk more just? Alexa mentioned participatory futures? What's that?
So, this refers to the process of integrating the traditional tools we have for predicting the future with participatory research to better understand the perspective of different communities.
And before you ask, participatory research is a form of research focused on specific communities and the challenges they face, based firmly on the involvement of those community members at every stage in the research.
And by combining traditional predictions with participatory research, we can better predict the sorts of risk different communities might be exposed to.
Sounds a lot like some of the stuff we were discussing in the first series about climate change. If you haven't listened yet, go do that after this episode. And if you already have listened to the first series, listen again. Our episodes are the gifts which just keep giving.
Okay, and the conversation then moved on to discuss AI, or artificial intelligence?
Yeah. So in the area of AI, researchers like Alexa aren't only looking at what risks does AI pose, but rather what risks does AI pose and for whom.
Which brings us neatly onto the role which artificial intelligence might play in perpetuating inequality. Almost as if we planned it or something. Alex, I wanted to point a question in your direction. So your research, if I understand it correctly, focuses on how technological innovations such as artificial intelligence can impact issues of equality, fairness, and justice. So we have a whole other episode in this series where we think in detail about artificial intelligence and how it might affect our lives in the future. But I'm wondering if you can tell us specifically about why AI might be a concern when trying to create a more fair or just society.
Yeah, well, what we have discovered now, I think through quite a bit of research, is that AI does seem to play a role in driving inequality through biased, for example, biased algorithms that are weeding out women for jobs, or not showing them high-paying jobs as they are doing their kind of Google searches, through basically new forms of algorithmic redlining that are really negatively impacting Black communities, Latino communities, through things like mortgages, through problems in algorithms in healthcare that are discriminatory. So there's a lot of worrying research that has come out to show that AI is really very much embedded in our societies and informed by all of the inequalities of our societies, and then begins to multiply them. So there's this really disturbing kind of feedback loop.
And Alexa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm given But I believe as well that there's this effect where like artificial intelligence is displacing quite a lot of work of people, and so like it's having these effects on workers and kind of like increasing the kind of structural inequalities between like workers and kind of other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I probably did put that very well.
You put it really well.
Do you mean in like skill sets, in terms of like the different skill set jobs that might be and not be and replaced? Is that what you meant?
I mean, I've read some research that indicated that particular, like kinds of skill sets will be more readily replaceable with artificial intelligence, and that might impact disproportionately on groups that are already kind of underemployed or economically worse off.
Yeah, I think the labor impacts of AI are really big and important and complex, because it's not just along like one axis or something. I think we have everything from the way that AI is so intimately entangled with the platform economy and the kind of Uberization of the economy. So that's one thing to think about. There's things to think about in terms of like how jobs will be automated, as you said, Natalie, and who will suffer the most from that kind of automation, and whose jobs may not be automated, but who may have worse working conditions nevertheless, that whose jobs may become less well rewarded. And then we also have this whole thing in which we have to think about the way that AI itself is full of invisible human labor through things like ghost working, or through people who are working on Amazon's kind of what do they call it now? The Mechanical Turk. So there's all sorts of labor implications.
So can I ask again about you kind of mentioned this intersection between artificial intelligence and a more just and fair society, and I'm just trying to tease apart three different things I think I can see here. There's the idea that it perpetuates maybe existing inequalities, the idea that it might multiply existing inequalities, and the idea that maybe it creates some inequality. I mean, like, are they all in the mix there? Is it more one than the other? Have I understood that correctly?
I think it's really all in the mix. And because we're talking about these very complex socio-technical relationships where everything is knit together. So maybe like one thing to think about here is how Joy Bolomini and Deb Raj talked about gender shades. So there's a really important study that showed that facial recognition is less accurate for dark-skinned people, particularly dark-skinned women. So that was a really important insight. But if you just correct facial recognition technology so that it's accurate for dark-skinned people and dark-skinned women, that doesn't make it just or fair technology, because we have to think then about the ways in which even a absolutely accurate facial recognition technology will be used in differential ways within communities who are already over policed and or like used by also ICE in the US, used by immigration. So it's like this I think goes back to our initial question about, well, what's fairness and justice? So you could have a kind of technically fair facial recognition technology that was just as accurate for Black women as it is for white men, but that would not make it a just technology.
May I ask a question, as coming from humanities and following things on the artificial intelligence only from newspapers, so in that my understanding is very limited. But can it be that it produces and magnifies injustices because they exist and because they are used by companies who are already driving this, or by governments who are fostering inequalities? Could it be an alternative vision? For example, the jobs that artificial intelligence will make redundant, that artificial intelligence will take over, are already the exploitative jobs that do not give that much space for creativity. So what if artificial intelligence takes over them, and then the governments give a basic income? Can there be a liberatory possibility out of this?
Yes, I think there could be. So I'd say two things. I'd say that one thing that's interesting to me is that we spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, what are the effects of artificial intelligence on society, which of course we should be doing, but in many ways the effects are quite easy to predict, because we can look at which groups of people in society already suffer the most vulnerability and discrimination, and then we can usually guess correctly that those are the groups of people who will be most affected by artificial intelligence. So there's, I think, that. But then if we want to think about, could we use this for more liberatory futures? I think that yes, we could, and that what you point to is really the key. Again, straight to the heart of the matter, Esra.
Which is ignorance brings you, I think, clarity.
Which is what are the structures under which these technologies are being produced? And right now, they're being produced for profit. They're being produced, to do the things that we already do, essentially, to just try to automate tasks we already do. But could we radically rethink this? Yeah, I think that we could, and that artificial intelligence is actually quite an interesting and powerful technology. That someone called it, I can't remember who this is, maybe I can find it. It's like statistics on steroids. So yeah, we could probably do really interesting things with finding patterns that then we could give attention to in new ways, so that maybe instead of using this is coming from a book on feminist technology, rather than using it to redline, could we use it to say oh, look, here we have a vulnerability, here we have people who are not getting loans as easily. How could we intervene? So yeah, I think we could do really interesting things.
It sounds like there are really liberatory and sort of emancipatory ways that AI could be used. I want to throw in another factor here, which is how do we think about this globally, and how do we think about this kind of in the context of the materiality of these technologies? And by that I just mean what kind of resources do we need if we were to have these liberatory AI arrangements? What would this look like in terms of how much compute would we need? How much physical resources would kind of go into the computers, and where would we be getting those from? And it seems like this is another aspect that and just to make a kind of analogy with the climate change example, when we have technologies in the case of climate change, technologies that we're using in terms of climate change mitigation, electric vehicles and batteries and the solar panels, we often actually see that although we can use these in the countries where we live to kind of decrease our carbon emissions, if we look at where the minerals and everything comes from for those, is often extracted from countries in Latin America, for example. There's a really good there's some really good work on this by Fioria Francos, who's a political scientist in the United States. And I guess when we're, kind of having these conversations about what would a good future with artificial intelligence look like here, like in the US or the UK, we also have to think, and like, how could we extend this to everyone around the globe and make this kind of emancipatory for everyone, not just ourselves? So I guess that's a bit of a provocation, maybe.
Yeah, I love that provocation, Natalie.
Yeah. I also feel like I wonder if artificial intelligence is serving as a mirror, because on the one hand, there is nothing surprising, right? As Alexa, you were saying, of course, it just reproduces the existing structural inequalities. But at the same time, it looks like there was an expectation that artificial intelligence would bring some sort of divine justice. Or maybe there was this idea that the inequalities that exist are not structural. There is some injustice, maybe because of some bad apple racists, or that the people who are not getting jobs were not deserving it anyway, or they were not working hard enough. So this artificial intelligence actually makes us realize it, so these people are not even given a chance to succeed, or that the system is so unjust that what it reproduces is this. It just makes it even worse. So maybe this moment of surprise, to me, it looks like bigger than a surprise it used to exist 20 years ago. Maybe we can use that for the kinds of changes that Natalie, you were mentioning. They would again exactly be the same kinds of things we would need to change injustice if there was no artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I think that the work that we need to do to create sort of liberatory artificial intelligence is the sort of work we need to do to create liberatory futures in general. And that's not just looking at the, like on the boat analogy, that maybe if on this sort of upper deck where we're seeing things, it's not just the risk there, it's also the benefit. And so we're talking a lot about the benefits of artificial intelligence for a very few people sitting in deck chairs and not for everybody. So if we want to think about it, in a systemic way, what Natalie talked about for climate change is the same thing. We have to look at, where do these minerals come from? What kind of energy are we using, or how are we putting artificial intelligence in to solve a problem that might be better solved by another tool? And what happens on the other end, where are all of these sort of material artifacts recycled? So that I think we have to look at the full life cycle of artificial intelligence, and then maybe what we would find in a more liberatory artificial intelligence is a very plural artificial intelligence, where it's not being just created by this very teeny, few people in the deck chairs for the few people in the deck chairs, but that people would use it as a tool to create, to solve various problems, in their communities. So there's lots and lots to think about here, because also if we think about the digital divide, there's so many people who are just not even included in this picture at all.
Yeah, but I think what you're pointing at is, as well, is this really important point, which is when we're talking about what a more just future looks like, it's about recognizing all of the people who are on the lower decks of the boat as agents in their own right, who have the power to kind of use technologies in their own ways, which the people who are on the top of the boat possibly can't even imagine. And those might be completely different uses of artificial intelligence, or of technologies to combat climate change, or whatever it is that we actually, you and I at Cambridge University just might not have in our heads at all, which I think is really cool, and kind of points to kind of the importance of making these conversations a lot wider, and making it not just us on the podcast.
I think that the one thing I would change is that I would like research agendas to be set by communities and not by academic researchers or technological researchers. I would like to have communities say what they think that researchers like all of us should be looking at. And I would like communities to have a say and say, oh, well, actually, the problem that we would like to solve, maybe through AI or another technology, is this.
What do you really look forward to when you think about the future? This whole series is about the future, and we're just, curious to find out from each of you what you look forward to thinking about the future. So we'll go to Esra.
Well, I I hope that these resources, make people who have been excluded from the table find the means to participate, to be in touch with each other, learn from each other, and demand what they deserve.
I really look forward to, I feel there's so much creativity, technological creativity, academic creativity, artistic creativity that we haven't gotten to enjoy in the world because some people are struggling so hard just to, get to the table and, get enough to eat. And I want to hear that. Like, I'm excited for that creativity.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Esra and Alexa just said. And also, I look forward to all of this occurring in a world where we don't have to worry about pollution and carbon emissions, and where we can actually be, just like a low carbon society with everything that means.
So that's it. Wow, you sure covered a lot of stuff there. Remind me again, what were some of the key points at the end?
Well, Esra made the point that artificial intelligence sort of acts like a mirror, reflecting back to us all of the inequalities, biases, and prejudices already there in society. So in this way, it's a great tool to help us identify where we are going wrong and how we can fix it.
I guess this is what our guests mean when they said that AI has the potential to give people social or political freedom and rights.
Alexa offered a great example around this term algorithmic red tape. So red tape refers to the process of following certain regulations or standards. As algorithms are clearly made to follow rules, they end up automating problematic procedures, making them invisible and hidden in the algorithm.
So, for example, racial or gender screening on job application sites stop particular applicants from seeing the top jobs. AI might automate the sorts of procedures that did this implicitly, beforehand. Not good. So looking deeper at how AI performs these selection processes could tell us why our own hiring practices were so unjust to begin with.
And we ended by imagining a carbon-free society in the future. But not only that, also a society which recognises the variety of different communities' needs, and a society built on justice and not just equality.
That sounds pretty amazing to me.
It is, and although this future might seem like a utopia from where we are now, what our guests are telling us is that research into existential risk and ethnographic studies into the different needs of different people is taking us one big step closer to this future.
Maybe if Sauron had a few My Little Pony dolls, he wouldn't have been so bad. Although maybe they would have had to be a My Little Balrog or something.
That brings us to the end of the episode.
Stay tuned for our next one about artificial intelligence.
I'm off to tidy up the deck chairs someone unkindly left lying around Mind Over Chatter HQ. I'm blaming Nick.
But before then, please fill out our survey. You can find the link in the episode description. To tell us what you think of the podcast.
Be honest.
And make sure to leave us a review on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts.
A good one, ideally.
And, as ever, please spread the Mind Over Chatter word by telling...
Just tell everyone.
A huge thanks once again to our guests, Alexa Hagerty, Natalie Jones, and Esra Ozyurek, and to our two fantastic behind-the-scenes help of this series, Thwaite and Charlotte Zemmel.
Music was by the extremely talented Carlo Ladd, and artwork by the equally talented Alex Sadler.
See you next time.
Bye.